Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Rhoda again, and let's talk today about. I think it's very important for us to talk about that when we get into open relationships and when now we have an increased number of sexual partners, there comes more risk. And it's a fact of life. And I think it's important to talk about and be more aware. And it's not just the risk of sexually transmitted infections, which is what everyone thinks about. It's also the risks of unintended pregnancies. Now, the issue is that growing up, most of us, from what we learned in sex education, whether it be from family, from our friends, from the medical establishment, was very fear-based. And while they might have meant well, most of us were taught more about being afraid of all these things than we were ever taught about pleasure or even human nature. And the fear of all of these things, that it may have been intended to keep us safe, yet mostly what it has done is it has kept us ignorant, it's kept us afraid, and caused us to be very judgmental about ourselves and others, which in the long run keeps us less safe. You hear people often using terms like clean or dirty when talking about their belief of whether they or someone else have or may have had an STI, which only makes the discussion more difficult and that much more judgmental. And of course, this kind of judgment only intensifies the fear and shame rather than being able to have a calm, rational, and informed discussion, which actually then causes us more risk instead of less. And I want to take a little bit different approach because the fear and the judgment are not the answer to really help you the most. Yeah, I think it's time that we need to talk about informed decision making and risk management. Think about it. There are so many risks that we're already taking in other areas of our lives besides sex that we don't even think about, and we're willing to take much higher risk than those and not even think twice about it. But then when it comes to sex, oh, suddenly we're all worried and afraid. I mean, think about it. Think about your driving. How often are you driving up the highway at 10, 15, 20 miles an hour over the speed limit? Or sometimes even more. How often do you wear your seatbelt? Or are you one of those people who click it behind the seat so the alarm doesn't go off? How often do you drive after having an alcoholic drink? Or two? Or three? Are you talking while you're driving on your cell phone? Do you look up directions or Google the nearest restaurant while you're driving? Or worse yet, are you texting and driving? Think about the risks you take with things like alcohol and drugs. How often are you overindulging? Is that a daily thing, a weekly thing? Even if you only do it once in a while, you can't have one or two drinks. It has to be 6 to 8. Think about the extreme sports that you might engage in. Are you engaging in things like bungee jumping or skydiving or even riding on a motorcycle? And if you do ride on a motorcycle, do you always wear your safety gear, such as your helmet, your leathers, your boots? Are you doing that even in the summertime? Or are you one of these people I see driving down the highway with no helmet, a t-shirt and cut-off jeans and flip-flops on? I'm not saying that we shouldn't take any precautions when it comes to the various sexual risks. But it's helpful to think about the levels of risk that you regularly take in other areas of your life. And the problem is that since STIs are so steeped in fear and shame and judgment, we somehow rate them as being worse because they come from sexual activity than the many, many other viral and bacterial infections that we as human beings are exposed to just because we're around other people every day. We don't think twice about breathing the same air as other people, touching surfaces as other people, or touching other people. And all the hand washing and hand sanitizer in the world is not going to guarantee that you're not going to contract the very wide range of what I like to call social infections, such as things like influenza and strep and mononucleosis and bronchitis and mumps and measles and rubella and encephalitis and many, many, many more. So if you were to contract one of those social infections from a friend, would you stop being friends with them? Would you be all mad because, you got strep throat from your friend? Probably not. And if so, then why do you think differently about infections that are transmitted through sex, such as things like chlamydia and gonorrhea and trichomonas and herpes and HPV and hepatitis? We have to remember that life is full of risks, and sex is just one of these areas where there's risk, and not over exaggerate the real risk compared to other risks in life. Unless you intend to live in a giant plastic bubble with filtered air pumped in, no physical contact with other humans, and your only form of sexual expression is masturbation, you cannot have zero risk. Even in monogamy, there's not zero risk. And you might ask why? Well, it's because the reality is that people break their agreements with their partners to only be sexual with them. And the majority of the time, their partner's not aware that they're having other sexual partners. So when you're going into open relationships, one of the things to consider is deciding what that might help you decide what type of relationship is really the best for you. Can also be the level of sexual risk you're willing to accept. I tend to think of it in like 3 levels. There's very little risk, which is a small pool of people. You might have 2 or 3 sexual partners who each also only have 2 or 3 partners, and everyone's been tested, and you know what the risks already are coming into those relationships. And this can be good for people who choose relationship styles, like things that are called polyfidelity or even monogamish, where they consider themselves to be fluid bonded. There's also then the medium risk. Now here you're probably going to have more than 2 or 3 partners, but this is going to involve very consistent use of condoms, whether it's male or female condoms, use of dental dams and condoms for oral sex, and semi-frequent testing, 2 to 3 times a year. And then you have, for some people, they're much more comfortable with higher risk. This may be some or even no condom use. They might use medications such as PrEP, which is a medication designed to reduce the risk of HIV infection. And look at more frequent testing, where it's 2 to 3 times, or every 2 to 3 months rather than 2 to 3 times a year. And there are many places such as county health boards and Planned Parenthoods where you can be tested and not have it part of your medical record that you would have if you go in to see your doctor and use your insurance. So, remember, risk is about percentages and statistics. You are going to see people who are going to contract an STI in their very first sexual experience in a monogamous relationship. You're going to have other people who've had hundreds of sexual partners with little or no serious STIs. And while many people do not want to admit it, there are still some groups out in the world that have higher rates of STIs than others. And believe it or not, there are studies out there that show that many swingers have lower rates of STIs than the general population. And this may be hard to believe, and I don't exactly know why this is. And maybe it's just because most swingers are expecting to have sex, and so they're planning to use protection. They keep condoms and lube on them when they go out, even whether they're expecting to have sex or not, rather than your typical vanilla person who goes out in the town, picks up some drunken stranger, and they're not prepared with protection, and they just decide to chance it anyway. Either way, as difficult as it can be, let go of your fear, your shame, your judgment, either of yourself or of other people, and let yourself start to think about the risk of unintended pregnancies and STI in a different way. It's not only good for you, but it's good for everyone. So that's all for today. And in a couple of days, I'm going to talk more about thinking differently about unintended pregnancies. I think that's very important to talk about because when you open your relationship, you may have to start to think about it differently. So that's it for today, and hopefully you'll join me then. Thanks so much.